high, typically it's the Byzantine reading. That's the one we go with. But when the percentages are closer, then we move into internal criteria to determine which reading goes in there. Now, my understanding is that you could technically end up with a non-Byzantine reading in that scenario, but those scenarios are very few and far between. In fact, I can't think of any that chooses something that's not Byzantine. So that's yeah, and I think I saw something somewhere. That's something you don't usually say when you're talking to people who do this kind of stuff. Where Peter had suggested that he learned a little bit about Byzantine priority. So we'll give him that. Anyway, so he goes on to say, it's that it's always prefers the Byzantine. It's that always that I've never been able to fully stomach. I find it incredible that the text found in any one manuscript or subset of manuscripts is always right. And technically speaking, he could be right. But this comes down to a question of presuppositions. So Byzantine priority typically presupposes that the Byzantine text type is what was used to formulate to transmit the New Testament. Now, again, not all Byzantine priorities think like that. I don't think Maurice would, Dr. Robinson, but that's kind of how I think. I unashamedly come to the table with this presupposition. So he goes, for this reason, both logical, could one scribe or series of them really get it right every time, and empirical, I haven't actually found a manuscript or a group of that always convinces me it's right. Yeah, so we would agree that a single manuscript is going to go off somewhere, right? There's going to be like no manuscript is letter by letter perfect for the entire New Testament. It's just, we know that. If they were there, somebody would have found them, and we'd know by now. But where I think we would disagree is that a group could and probably does go back to the original text. So in this case of empirical reasons, I primarily have in mind internal evidence. See, there he goes. There it is. It's the internal evidence. Let me make this maybe I can make this a bit bigger. Yeah, there we go. So he goes to internal evidence, and this is what I was telling you about earlier, is that this is a distinction between external evidence or internal evidence. So evidence that I don't see how a Byzantine prioritist can use consistently. So he's telling us that we can't use the internal evidence consistently. And again, this is why I don't particularly like internal evidence, because he's kind of saying Byzantine priorists can't use this consistently. But I don't think even our critical text brothers use internal evidence consistently. And I don't even know or think that it's possible to consistently use internal criteria. In fact, I don't even think even if you could just use it totally consistently, there's no guarantee that the scribes made the errors as consistently as we use those internal criteria. Again, this is another reason why I don't particularly like internal criteria. But we go on. So I've written about this before, and today I want to look at another example of the same problem. Here is the text of 1 John 4:19 in the RP 12 edition of the Byzantine text and the NA 28. So he's got Himis agapomen avton. So that's him. Hoti avtos protos iabisanimas. And then, of course, we have the Nestle Allen 28 without the avton in it. So he goes on to say the only difference is the minor one of direct object of the verb agapomen. So there is no direct object for the verb agapomen in the Nestle Allen 28, but there is for the RP 2005. Now, let's read it. So now, how would someone who thinks the original reading is always found in the Byzantine manuscripts explain the omission of avton here? So what he's doing, Dr. Guri is using internal criteria to figure out what to do here, and then says, okay, now that I'm using internal criteria, now you have to use internal criteria to determine what's going on here. Now, right off the hop for me, I don't need to go into the the internal criteria, because for me the external criteria is clear. The Byzantine manuscripts, 85% of them, I think it's like 84 point something, all agree that avton is in the manuscript tradition. So whereas Dr. Peter Guri is going to go to the internal evidence, I'm going to stop at the external and say we don't need to go any further. So he goes on to say the simple answer is homoteleuton. The new ending led some scribes to omit off tone by accident, and the scribes of the Byzantine manuscripts preserved the longer form faithfully for us. Yes, so if we wanted to explain with internal criteria, this is exactly where we would go. So we have off tone as the reading. We have ton theon as another reading in here, and both the new at the end could be considered, based off of the new in agapomen, could be seen as skipping everything in between and going straight into hoti. Now that's great. So Dr. Peter Gurry has done some of the work for us. So if we wanted to go to the internal criteria, that's exactly what we would do. Now he tends to say that there's an issue here because if you look internally, there's no way that you would get this textual variant, ton theon, or this variant, ton kyrion, or even off tone, which he would consider a variant. So he goes, well, how do you explain these 4 different readings? And using internal criteria, where he would go, and where he does in this article, is he says the best one that explains all of them is the omission. Because in the mind of people like Dr. Gurry, or even in Metzger, which we just read, they say, well, it's very strange that there is no, there is nothing after the verb akabomen. It's not an intransitive verb, right? It sounds weird to the Greek speaker. And so when they come to it and there's nothing after the verb, it's more than likely that someone's going to go, okay, let's add this. So that's their argument. That's Dr. Game. There's lots of explanations for why these are here. But just to kind of break down what he has for us. So the omission he has with Alexandrinus and Vaticanus, and then a number of minuscule manuscripts. Latin, I'm not sure what these are. Gothic, maybe? Slavonic? I'm not sure what K is. And then for Avton, the one that's the Byzantine reading, which has 84-point-something% of all the manuscripts together, has 044. We'll take a look at that one today. I've got it listed up here. And then Ton Theon, which has about 13% of the readings, has Sinaiticus as an example. We'll take a look at that as well. And then Ton Kyrion has 629, which again is another interesting manuscript. And of course, this is the only manuscript, 629, with the reading Ton Kyrion. So we can essentially bump that one off like right away. And I have an explanation for that, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. So he goes on to say, since all 3 of the longer readings end in new, how does a Byzantine prioritist decide which of them is original? Right? We do by using the external criteria. He might reason easily enough that reading 3 and 4 are natural expansions of simple pronoun off tone, which is exactly what I'm going to do. So I would agree. The problem, however, is in giving a convincing reason why that same argument doesn't also apply to reading 2. If scribes wanted to make the implicit explicit here, as all must agree they did, why else would we have this particular variance here? Now, I'm having trouble trying to understand the reasoning here, and I think this is probably key to what he's trying to say. So we come back up here. So if we say, well, someone just wanted to put the pronoun in, explain the pronoun with ton theon, that makes sense. But where I have trouble with is the implication of someone trying to explain the lack of it by putting it in there. I don't fully understand exactly what he's saying there. But we'll go on. Then why shouldn't reading 2 be rejected for that very reason? Because 85% of the manuscripts have it. Again, we have that external criteria that goes along with the... I don't think you can take the internal criteria by itself. And as much as Dr. Gurry wants to do that, we can't. But see, he isn't necessarily either. Because what he's going to do is he's going to go in here and look at that and go, oh, look, Vaticanus and Alexandrinus both have it there. So that also shores up our internal reading. Our internal argument. Whereas I go, well, it's in 85%. And it's in the Byzantine majority text. It's in the Byzantine text. So that shores up my explanation. We'll continue reading here. I can't see a way around this except to accept reading 1 as the best explanation for the origin of all 3 readings. Side note, this is why using a small apparatus can be misleading. Yes. This, it seems, exposes a flaw in the Byzantine priority scheme. If it cannot use the same internal argument consistently within the same variant, what grounds does it have for claiming the transmissional consideration coupled with internal principles point to the Byzantine text form as a leading force in the history of transmission? Yeah, so again, I'm inclined to go with external criteria first. I don't think that 85% of the manuscript tradition for this one reading necessitates us to go in and do a deep dive into the internal criteria. As I've said earlier, Dr. Gurry will take his internal criteria, go, okay, this is it, and then he'll look at the external criteria and say, oh, it's in Vaticanus and Alexandrinus. So it almost seems like it's backwards, or I shouldn't say backwards. Let me be a little more charitable. It looks like he's looking at it the opposite way that I am. So he's going internal first and then external, whereas I'm going external first and then internal. All right. So he says, I confess, I would find the Byzantine priority position more consistent if it said that transmission considerations, i.e. external evidence, is decisive, and that internal evidence is only needed secondarily for a large split in the Byzantine witness. He agrees with me! Yay! I don't know how I missed this. I don't know how I missed that. I did read it. How did I miss that? At that point, we would still have to discuss the logical objection I mentioned, but that would be a post for another day. As it is, the internal evidence is a key reason why I find any all-or-nothing approach to the Byzantine text or any other text unconvincing. As Tommy et al. Have put it, no single manuscript family, or larger group of manuscripts, a text type, can be accepted uncritically as representing the original version of the biblical passage or book. Now, to be fair, right, it's not necessarily uncritically accepting the Byzantine text. There are reasons for believing that the Byzantine text contains the original text. So we're not going to go into that today. But this is an interesting variant because, like I said, it generally shows the presuppositions that we come to when we look at this textual variant. Well, just generally, when we look at textual variants. I'm taking an external approach first. He appears to be taking an internal criteria approach first. So you could say, well, you know, at least he's doing it consistently. But I don't know. Is he? Does modern eclecticism have a consistent way of approaching that? I don't know. I don't know if they would say that either. This is an interesting idea, because if you take a look at textual variants on a case-by-case basis, like you look at Mark 16:9 through 20. Mark 16:9 through 20 is mostly like the argument for the removal of that passage is mostly internal criteria. There's like 2 manuscripts in the Greek tradition that don't have it, in 304, but there's some interesting things going on there. Even then, they leave space for it. Even then, it looks like they're aware of the reading. There's some things in Latin going on, but not a whole lot of it. So the external evidence is on the side of Mark 16:9 through 20, and yet modern critical methodology seems to suggest, now they're just suggesting it, right, because they're not making us change our Bibles and remove it, but they're suggesting that it's the internal criteria. In fact, the argument for Mark 16:9 through 20, the omission of it is because, you know, Mary Magdalene is put in twice, and or is introduced twice, and the vocabulary of Mark in 16:9 through 20 is different than anywhere else in the scriptures, and so we conclude that it's not part of scripture, even though it's got all the support. But we have Sinaiticus and Vaticanus backing us up, and so you see when it comes to Mark 16:9 through 20, I think there's a consistency there. I think with what's described here by Dr. Gurry, and that is, you know, internal criteria first, and then external criteria backs up what you've selected internally. So in my case, again, I'm coming to this textual variant by saying external variants first, external criteria first, and then the internal will back up what I've selected externally. And what's interesting is when I use the external criteria, it's a lot more objective than the internal criteria. And again, that's why I go in that direction. That I just typically think in that way. All right, so let's we'll finish reading this article in just a moment. We have a few comments here. I haven't read them in a little while. Let's take a look. Where are we? We had some trouble with the audio, with the audio earlier. We got that all fixed up. Ross says, okay, we can hear you. Christian Childler, with him, it seems to point to the first table of the law, while without points to the second table. It seems correct to include him because it makes sense with other scriptures, in my opinion. Yeah, and again, that's like, I don't have any issues with that. It's an internal argument, and it just happens to agree with the external argument. So yeah, no, that's great. That's good. The Vulgate, oddly, goes with an imperative. Oh, interesting. Love because he's first loved us. Interesting. 629 has an interesting reading there. Christian Chidestar says, Stephanus uses the subjunctive. Yeah. Friendly Neighborhood Jesus Freak. Amiatanus is interesting. That's one of the oldest Latin manuscripts that we have. It has, let us therefore love one another because God first loved us. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. Valdensis has, let us therefore love because God first loved us. And then neither of these match the Clementine Vulgate. Let us therefore love God because God first loved us. And then Kestra says hello. Hello, Kestra. How's it going? Good to see you. You made a live stream. All right. So Peter Gurry ends his message with this. He says, yes, Byzantine manuscripts are very good overall. Very good overall. He's got an article there. But that doesn't mean they're always right. All right. Baby Gremlins, hey, how's it going? Doodles, Dwayne. You heading out? We'll see you around. All right. Now, what's really good about this is when you come down to the comments, a little bit of back and forth between Dan Wallace and Dr. Robinson. I'll zoom that out a little bit. So Dan Wallace asks Peter about his opening statement. The most noteworthy feature of the Byzantine priority position to me is not that it seriously values the Byzantine text. I think that's generally good. It's that it always prefers a Byzantine text. Hodges and Farstad did not do this. 15 minority readings in the PA and 150 in the Apocalypse were published as a text in their own edition of the MT. Of course, Pickering said that his mentor Zane had given the theory a black eye, and the RP text has, so far as I can tell, only majority readings. Is that right, Maurice? Yeah, so when it comes to the discussion surrounding the manuscript tradition and majority and stuff, the story of the woman caught in adultery in the Book of Revelation are the outliers. We don't particularly use the same sort of way of going about things because if you go with like a strict K reading, you end up with a non-majority reading. So for those who don't know, the story of the woman caught in adultery was kind of broken up into 7 groups. I think it was von Soden went through and he cataloged all the manuscripts with the story of the woman caught in adultery, and he kind of came up with 7 major groupings. So grouping 5, 6, and 7 are of interest here because grouping 5 goes, the RP goes with grouping 5. Grouping 6 is the Hodges Farstad, and grouping 7 is the F35 text, so Pickering's text. And they all kind of have their little quirks and things, and they're about evenly split, just generally speaking. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but they're about evenly split. So basically a third is how they typically go. So, of course, when you come to the PA, you're almost at a point where you're left with internal criteria. I haven't delved too much into that, but it's the same thing with a number of readings in the Book of Revelation. But yeah, so it goes, when Hodges taught the course in New Testament textual criticism in the 70s at Dallas Seminary, I recall him saying that his genealogical work would prove, he thought, that the Byzantine text was always right. To his credit, excuse me, he allowed his method to overturn his presupposition 165 times. So then, Maurice responds. So we got the big guns in here. Dan Wallace and Maurice Robinson are duking it out in the comments of this article. So actually, Maurice is just going to explain what he did with the text. So Dan asks, the RP text has, so far as I can tell, only majority readings. Is that right? And then Maurice responds, only where Biz and Gothic M, so that's Biz is Byzantine, Gothic M is majority in the apparatus, where it's undivided. But this also holds for the Hodges Farstad edition. So where Biz itself is heavily divided, The RP edition, like Hodges Farstad's in many instances, follows a reading with somewhat lesser but still substantial numerical support. Not always the case with the HF due to their semantic approach. Of course, most such occurrences in both Hodges Farstad and RP occur in the Apocalypse, but in the RP, the HF type of stemmatics is absent. So I should also note that in the PA, most significant variant readings necessarily are minority, given that the primary transmissional lines there, von Soden's 5, 6, and 7, often divide so as to produce only non-majority variants within that pericope. So the PA is an exception to the rule in the Robinson-Pierpont text. All right, let's move on. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to come back up here and take a look at these things, and then I'll give you my theory, my internal criteria theory. Before we do that, let's play with the cutscene. All right. I got some new toys. So let's take a look at the comments here real quick, and then we'll take a look at some of this evidence here, and I'll give you an internal explanation of this passage. All right. So Baby Gremlins, Toodles Dwayne. Oh, Toodle. Okay. Every time I hear Toodles, that's somebody saying goodbye in our dialect up in Canada. All right, KGV is always right. All right, Baby Gremlins. It's an important variant because with him removed, it means that God's love for us inspires us to love both him and people, not just him. This would be a powerful statement about God's influence. I would almost agree with you. But you would have a hard time reading through the scripture and saying that your love is enabled to love God and to not love others. Like I just like if you read through the book of 1 John, loving one another, agapo men alilon, let us love one another, right? Like that's a phrase all throughout 1 John. 1 John is all about loving God and loving others. Like you can't escape it, whether him is there or him is not. In fact, there's the whole bit about like if you hate your brother and you say you love God, you're a liar and the truth is not in you. Like this is a theme throughout the entirety of John's gospel. You can't miss it. You can't miss that theme unless you're just looking at that half of that verse. Yeah, I would almost agree with you, Baby Grims, almost. But I think that if somebody does their due diligence and not just takes a passage out of context, whether him is in there or not, you would have a hard time reading that in any other way to suggest that God is allowing us to just love him and not others. It's a theme throughout 1 John. DK, you get lost. I think he's in there. Hey, Pastor Brett, thanks for the super chat. Evening all. How's it going, brother Brett, Pastor Brett? I've seen a couple of your live streams. I just haven't been able to pop on. It's been rather busy here, but it's going to get really busy. The spring is on its way. We got our first order of seeds in, and we're going to start planting shortly. We get everything going in the house, and then we get the lights on them. And then what happens after that is when the weather gets nice, we get out in the garden. We begin planting stuff. So, all right. Bold as a lion saying hello to Pastor Brett. James Sheffield says British captains used to take 3 or 5 clocks on ships, and the 2 clocks that agreed would be considered correct. Yeah, there we go. Excuse me. All right. Pastor Brett says, have some coffee and Timbits. I will have coffee, but I can't have Timbits. I'll tell you a little personal story. I've decided to give the carnivore diet a try, and so I have been eating just straight up meat for the last week and a half. And I finally made it, I think, over the hump of keto flu. That's what they call it, when you just feel like garbage because you're not getting carbs anymore. And so I'm getting, quote, fat adapted. So just something, I gotta lose a few pounds. It's supposed to help with cognitive abilities and mental clarity. And so I figured I'd give it a shot and see what happens. I'd like steak and bacon and butter and eggs, and I figured if I do something that I like, I'm going to stick with it. And I'm already down 8 pounds. So it's working out pretty good. So, so Timbits, maybe later. I'm going to give this go for 90 days and see what happens. Pastor Brett, you're well. Hope you got everything sorted out with your house there. I remember hearing you talk a little bit about that. All right. What are we going to do now? Right, we're going to take a look. Excuse me. We're going to take a look. Oh, wrong button. There it is. Okay, screen share. There we go. Okay, I'm here. So we're going to take a look at this evidence. So what Dr. Gurry here is suggesting for this variant is that the internal way of explaining this reading, him, you cognitive, to explain what Dr. Gurry is suggesting here is that the omission of him best explains the fact that there's a textual variant for of tone, which is him, ton theon, which is God, and ton kyrion, which is the Lord. So if you have of tone, it doesn't explain the ton theon or the ton kyrion, but you can explain the omission because of homotelioton, right? The nu is similar to the nu and on the end of agapomen, and so you would lose the entire phrase or entire word off tone and go straight into the text. So yeah, wrong lever. That's right. So that's a suggestion here. Now, what we would normally do is say, well, if you take a look, let me see if I can get my stuff here. Yeah. So if you take a look at how John uses love, and this article, Dr. Gurry actually mentioned this briefly, but I think he just kind of fluffed it off, and I don't think he really should have. And here's why. Because if you look at how love is used, and I don't mean just like how, whether it's the subjunctive or the indicative, right? Because that's what's in question here. Whether it's the subjunctive or the indicative, how it's used in the New Testament. And generally speaking, every instance, I forget how many there are. I think there was just maybe over 100. And I looked at every instance. And every instance, the word agapomen always has a direct object. If it doesn't have a direct object, it has a modifier. And out of all the instances, okay, aside from the one that we're looking at, there were 2 places where there was an adverb without a direct object. Okay, and those passages I'll just share with you. And this is the entire New Testament. This isn't just John. This is the entire New Testament. So in Luke 7:47, let me pull this up here. I just need to check and make sure I'm sharing. Yeah. So in Luke 7:47. Luke 7:47. Excuse me. It says, "Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much." Okay, much, that's an adverb. Okay, this is adverbial. This is essentially an intransitive verb. And this is one of the only times we see this intransitive verb here in Luke 7:47, but it's still modified. It's not just she loved and then left alone. It's not. There's a modifier on there. Now, the other instance where we see this same thing going on is actually in 1 John. So if we go to 1 John 3:18, it's, "My little children, let us not love," okay? "Let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth." So in this instance, we have the subjunctive love, right? Used hortatorily. Let us not love. And there's no direct object. But, again, it's not standing by itself. It is modified with another phrase. And what's the phrase? In word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Okay, so this is just like a general exposition of how the proper way is to love. It's not just about saying things. It's not just about being, saying the right words, but it's in the action, doing the right things, right? That's how you show love. Anyone can say a word, but for someone to stand up and take action, right? That's another thing altogether. But again, we have "let us not love," but it's not standing on its own. It's intransitive, but it's not unmodified. Now, when we come to our passage, again, in 1 John 4:19, let's come back here. We'll just do it this way. We love because he first loved us. Now, this would be the only place in the entirety of the New Testament where the word agapomen, whether it's subjunctive or indicative, really doesn't matter at this point, where it occurs without a modifier. Every other place, every other instance, if the critical text is true here, every other instance has a modifier on agapomen. So I think if we're going to go internally, that would be one argument in a couple that says we can explain this by saying we don't have to go to the hard reading, right? If someone comes across this and we love and it doesn't have a direct object, we would say, well, it's a harder reading, and somebody's going to expect some sort of modifier on this word, and so they're going to put it in. Okay, that if we're going to say, well, it's the harder reading, then we say, okay, it's the harder reading because people just aren't used to hearing it without some sort of modifier on it. However, the flip side of that, again, this is your presupposition. What do you think about the text beforehand? The flip side of it is that, well, maybe it's the harder reading because it's a nonsensical reading. Now, I mean, it's not nonsensical in the sense that it doesn't make sense. It makes sense without the direct object. Don't get me wrong. But nobody in the entire New Testament has used the word love in that way. So it seems to suggest that it's the hard reading because it's the right because it's the wrong reading. Again, this is the impasse, and I think it's really important to recognize that this is the impasse. For some people, they're going to see the hard reading and be like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And some of them are going to look at this and say, yeah, I see that it's a hard reading, and that's because it's a wrong reading. So, again, right, important to recognize that impasse. Now, let's take a look at, you can look at 1 John 4:7 real quick, because this is an interesting usage of love. But, beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. And you might go, look, right there, who loves? Everyone who loves. That's intransitive, but this is a participle in Greek. This is not an indicative or subjunctive. This is a participle. And participles work a little bit differently than subjunctives and indicatives. So that doesn't count. And that's the only other instance that I found. Now, I didn't do a whole big search on that. I'm sure if you found stuff, it's used in that way all the time. Apostle pistemon, all those who believe, right? Or a few others. That's not a very good a very good example. All right. So whenever John uses the indicative, he always has a direct object. We just went through all that. Now, here's another interesting one. So if you come back to this list of manuscripts here, we talked a little bit about homoteleuton. And so homoteleuton, again, is when you take the... let me see if I got it here. We can take a look at that. I should have pulled up the Greek. But what happens is, if you take the N from agapomen, here it is. So if you take this N here, am I still showing my screen? Just checking, yeah. Yeah, so if you take this new here, a scribe, I've been calling it an N. What is wrong with me? So a scribe, right, he's looking over at one page and he's copying on this page. And so he's looking back and forth and going back and forth. And so what happens is he copies down agapomen, and then he looks over to get the next word. And what he sees is the N, right? But he misses everything here because he thinks the N he's looking at is the N from here. And so when looking back at this end, he skips over everything here and goes straight to hoti. So we can explain on internal grounds on, yeah, it's a total possibility that early on somebody went and did parablepsis, just missed it, right? Mixed it up, skipped over the bunch because the endings were the same. So again, that's another evidence internally that suggests that this could be the same. Now, what do we do about these other readings? How did these get about? And I think I have a theory, and then not only do I have a theory, but then I have a second one that has an example. So the theory goes like this. Typically in the lectionary cycle, You may start a lection or a reading with a passage that has a bunch of pronouns in it. And of course, when you do a lection, what you do is you end up taking a portion of scripture. Oftentimes, it's just a short snippet of text, kind of pulled out of its context. So when you have a whole bunch of pronouns in there, you don't know what the pronoun is referring to, because that was maybe in the reading from last week or from yesterday, and nobody remembers what it was from the day before. So sometimes what would happen in the lectionary is they would exchange a pronoun for a proper noun. So in this case, it's possible. Now again, I tried to go in to look at the lectionaries, but they are so difficult to look at. I couldn't verify this. So if somebody else is even more like capable, go and check this out. But I'm willing to bet that if you go into the lection reading for 1 John 4:19, you will probably find, instead of auton, that you might find ton theon. You might find ton theon in there, or you might find ton kyrion. Although we don't take ton kyrion seriously because it's got a singular reading and it's attached to manuscript 629. And I've taken a deep look at 629. It's a rather interesting manuscript, but it's not entirely trustworthy. I mean, it's decent, but like there's a number of interesting things happening in 629. We'll take a look at that. Well, we won't, because it's on. I wish I could. Maybe it's on CS and NTM. We'll take a look at that. But yeah, so with that, I like internally, we can totally make sense of off-tone. And essentially it's going to come down to, well, what do you find more convincing? Do you find it more convincing that the omitted text might explain why there's two variants there? Or do you find it more convincing that 85% of the manuscripts have it, and the potential of a lectionary manuscript adding something to make sense of the pronoun? Now, I took a look at a number of manuscripts and their dates. I can pop that up here. But of the manuscripts that omit the reading, let me pull this up here. I've listed them here by date. So we've got like a 5th century, 4th century, 14th, 13th, 12th, 11th, 12th, 10th, 13th, 14th, 19th. Most centuries have a representative with the omission in it. So why is that important? Well, because if you're looking at the omission, we're going to assume, I think generally what happens is we just assume that the omission now is carrying over, that they're all related in some way, and so the omission carries on because a scribe didn't see it there and didn't copy it there. But what this suggests by having such a wide a range of dates here, potentially, right, and this is strengthening the argument for homoteleuton, is that all throughout the centuries, if this is a homoteleuton thing, we would expect to see this kind of error happen from time to time throughout the life, throughout the copying process, not just in a moment, and not just in a moment in the past, and then all of a sudden it's we've got a family tree of that. So these manuscripts could very well have had exemplars with, in fact, statistically probably could have had exemplars with off-tone, and then homoteleuton, right? The scribe who wrote down one of these manuscripts may have missed it. So this doesn't represent a single line of manuscripts without the reading. So again, that strengthens the argument that off-tone could still be part of the original text. So let me check my notes here. I don't think I have much more going on. Yeah, I think that's it. So what we can do now is let's take a look at some of the comments, and then we'll take a look at a few manuscripts just because they're neat. All right. Okay. What do we got going on here? Some coffee and Timbits. You're doing well. You cognitive. Ha. Yes, I hit the wrong button there. I know. I pulled up the I pulled up the new stuff. Bold as a lion says my brother is a carnivore and keto. That's awesome. Pastor Rhett says I'm having coffee and Timbits. Awesome. I was gonna make a coffee earlier, but it's a little bit late now. Friendly Neighborhood Jesus Freak says, for anyone who isn't aware, Tim Hortons is almost as big in Western New York as it is in Canada. I didn't know that. I did not know that. Jew and Greek says, never heard participle pronounced like that. Interesting. How do you pronounce it? I've always pronounced it participle. Maybe I'm just read and never heard it before. Friendly neighbor Jesus Freak says, I have. Maybe that's because I live in close proximity to Canada. Well, there you go. You're probably super close to the border, I guess. And there's another possibility that off tone was the original, but it fell out, and then the variants rose from a text where it had fallen out. That could very well be too. Yeah, you could be looking at a divergent stream between tone theon and tone kyrion. You could be looking at a divergent stream from the same source. Possible, but again, we wouldn't be able to prove that externally, right? Interesting theory nonetheless. Having a cognitive moment? I have cognitive moments all the time. Pastor Brett laughing. Nice. All right. Let's take a look at some manuscripts here. So off tone. Oh, here we go. There we go. So off tone uses, so the earliest manuscript we have, or I should say the only unsealed manuscript we have, is 044, and I went and found it here. Now, just so you're aware, 1 John doesn't have a lot of older manuscripts in support of it. I think there's like 6 or 7. It's not very many. And then a couple of those, the passage we're looking at wasn't even in there. So it stopped just shy of that. But in this example, we can see it right here. Hemis agapomen of tone. There it is, of tone, 044. So this is a 9th century manuscript. And you're not going to get much below a 9th century manuscript on this one, again, just because the evidence is scarce. Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and then Sinaiticus would be the older ones that contain it, that contain this passage, but they don't have the reading. Sinaiticus, though, has tone theon, and that was one that I was going to go look at. So if we pull that up here, let's see. It's probably going to do something with the stream here while I'm looking for this. Excuse me. All right, I'm getting distracted here. So let's go to 4:19. Yeah, I'm getting a warning on the stream health. I might be like jaggy a little bit. That's okay. We'll give it a second. The stream will come back. Let's zoom in. Zoom in. It's the bottom of the 3rd. At the bottom of the 3rd, it's like we're playing a game of baseball there. There it is. Can you see that? Can I make it any bigger? I can. All right, there it is. Can I make this bigger? No, I can't. Interesting. Okay. We're stuck. We're stuck. That's what it is. All right, so we have the verse there. Agapomen, we love. Ton theon, God. We love God. So again, I think this is this reading here, the ton theon, we love because he first loved us, or we love God because he first loved us. It is represented by around 13% of the total manuscripts that are out there. So again, kind of neat that we can see it in Codex Sinaiticus. But again, this isn't particularly the best reading to use for 1 John 4:19. Again, I firmly believe it's him. It's him. Off tone is the reading, because that's, well, generally speaking, that's the super majority. So that's more inclined to where I am gonna go with that one. So I think that's pretty much it. I think we covered the basis here. The bias that I was talking about, I didn't really talk a whole lot while we were going through this, but the presupposition is about how we come to the text with how we think we should come to the text, right? I don't think that we all necessarily look at all of the manuscripts and then come to our conclusions. We have to come up with some procedures first that help us to look into the manuscripts, and then we come out with a conclusion based on those procedures. So in this example here, this article that Peter Gurry shared with me, it's clear that he's putting a premium on the internal criteria. And so he comes to the text with this internal criteria and says, well, I think that it should be this and that, and this this is the harder reading, and so the harder reading is to be preferred in this case because so on and so forth. And then you go on and say, and then it's supported by, Alexandrinus and Codex Vaticanus. But again, my presupposition essentially says that we ought to go with the external evidences first, and to attach something to that being Byzantine priority. I say the largest coherent family of manuscripts is more than likely to contain the original text. And so we take that external criteria first, and because in this example it's 85% of all the manuscripts have the reading hymn, we would go with hymn, and that's in keeping with tradition, in the sense of, I know people hear tradition, they get scared, right? In the sense of, in the sense of that's the reading that was passed down from generation to generation, and so I'm inclined to go with that one. That's the church from at least 044 up until the current time. Even the Textus Receptus goes with him in this instance. And I think this approach is better because external criteria is less subjective than internal criteria. For each point that Dr. Guri brought up, I could bring up another point. And I know he would do the other thing with me and say, for every point you brought up, I brought up. And I think there's one instance in here where he referred, he didn't call it Occam's razor, but did say that something, there was less of an economic cost on one. And by that I mean, I think he means that it's a simpler theory. But I don't think you can just go, well, it's a simpler theory. Occam's razor. I don't think Occam's razor is not a proof of all things. It's just it's a statement. It may be true or may not be, but oftentimes it is. But we're looking at textual criticism, and textual criticism is exceptionally complicated. Exceptionally complicated. There is no Occam's razor in current modern eclectic methods. It's a complicated thing. And when we talk about consistency is only great when scribes consistently make the same errors. And I don't think we can come to the point where we say scribes consistently make the same errors. And this is an inherent weakness with any sort of methodology that is out there. So you're going to come up with a bunch of rules. You have your text critical canons and all these things. And you take, for example, just in this instance alone, can we consistently apply homoteleuton every time it occurs? Should we consistently apply it all the time whenever there's when something can be explained by homoteleuton? No, I don't think so, right? And I don't think the modern eclectic guys would either. But you can't consistently apply something like that. You have to put a judgment into other rules to determine a priority for your canons of Scripture. And again, I don't see that. I can't see that as being consistent. And even if it were, again, I know I'm killing it here. I'm kicking a dead horse. But even if we did have a consistent canon and priority of those canons, even if it was consistent all the time, the implication is that the scribes, when they were copying manuscripts, consistently made errors in that same mode of canonization. And I don't see that being the case. I think the canons are good to an extent, but they don't answer everything. And so what I do is I would plug in something like a traditional text argument. So I know our Textus Receptus guys will go, well, the TR is it. And that's fine and that's fair. But I'm inclined to go further back into the past. And this is one of the main reasons why I tend to go with a Byzantine position instead of a TR position, is because we can look at the Byzantine manuscripts, which go back as far as the 5th century that we know of. Alexandrinus, for example, in the Gospels is a consistent Byzantine text, a consistent Byzantine witness. And we can go that far back, and we can say, see, it's there. whereas the Textus Receptus not so much. Now, with that being said, the Textus Receptus itself, for the most part, reflects the Byzantine text. So I don't have much of an issue with those who would maintain the Textus Receptus. I think that's great. So yeah, that's my little rant, my little discussion on this rather insignificant textual variant in 1 John 4:19 or 17. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Let's pop over to the comments and see what y'all are saying. But first, I'm going to play with the seat. There you go. All right. I'm going to get that figured out one of these days. Excuse me. All right. What are we saying here? So I've heard participle. Yeah, that's how I say it, participle. And some say participle. Yeah. Excuse me. All right, Pastor Rhett says, just read the KJV, you won't have any problems. I love the KJV. I read it practically every day. All right. Christian Chidestar says, the King Jimmy is a spicy translation. Spicy. You're not eating your Bible, are you? Pastor Brett, which TR do you use? I thought Achim was the name of a shaver. Oh. Oh, your mouth's getting dry. All right. Friendly Neighborhood Jesus Freak says, as I mentioned before, the stream, my own translation, conflated the TR with the Vulgate, resulting in we love God because he loved us first. Excuse me. All right. Yeah, that's the other variant. I think that's more of a Vulgate thing. In fact, if you go to 629, which is the one that says the Lord, excuse me, that's directly influenced by the Latin translation beside it. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think the meaning is there in a contracted form in the line right next to it. So 629 is definitely a Latinized Greek text, or so it seems. Which is interesting because it's the same manuscript that contains the aberrant form of the comma, where it says apo to uranu, from heaven instead of in heaven, and from earth instead of in earth. So yeah, 629 is a rather interesting manuscript. It's got some very interesting readings in there. And probably almost worthwhile devoting a whole video to it. Maybe at some point we'll take a look. Pastor Brett, Christian, KJV. Yes, Brett thinks the KJV is a TR. All right, Pastor Brett also says that is the better translation, Steve. That is the better translation, Steve. All right. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you guys have a good rest of the evening, and until next